The original Prince of Persia was a side-scrolling platformer that was regarded as a classic when it first came out, and is still pretty fun even today. I played a version of it that had been ported to the 3DS, and while I wouldn't say it's a great game, it is still good. While most platformers tend to follow in Super Mario Bros. Footsteps, where the player can leap 20 times their height, have specialized superpowers, fall damage doesn't exist, and any connection with real-world physics is tentative at best, Prince of Persia offered a different take on platforming. It was more grounded and realistic. You couldn't run or jump beyond what one would expect for a normal human being, and falling any height more than 10 feet would almost certainly kill you. As a result, you had to be much more deliberate and cautious as you navigated the game's levels, and there was much more emphasis on avoiding traps than on jumping puzzles. There was also the occasional sword fighting mixed in here and there, which was a little finicky but offered a nice aside to break up the platforming. Overall, it was quite fun. Years later, another game based on this title came out called Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, which is widely regarded as one of the best games ever made. And after playing through it, I would say that assessment is pretty accurate. Sands of Time is to the Prince of Persia games what Super Mario 64 was to the Mario games, or Ocarina of Time to the Zelda series. A game that retains everything that makes the series so fun, while successfully translating it into 3D and adding its own unique touches as well. In Prince of Persia, you obviously take control of the Sultan of Agrabah. Just kidding, you play as the Prince of Persia. When the game opens up, your father is waging a battle against an enemy city. During the battle, the prince sneaks through the city in order to steal something from the enemy treasure vault and earn glory that way, rather than being directly engaged in the battle. This section serves as the tutorial, and is pretty good. Once he reaches the treasure vault, he obtains the Dagger of Time, and shortly thereafter the battle is over, with Persia winning. It turns out the vizier of the enemy city betrayed his own people, which is what allowed Persia to win so easily. The vizier did this because he wanted to get his hands on the Dagger of Time and on an enormous hourglass containing the Sands of Time. He did this because he wants to use them to achieve immortality. A fairly typical motive for a villain, but his scheming does become a bit more relatable when we see that he's also been coughing up blood. He's not just a greedy man wanting to live forever, he's also a desperate man who is reminded daily about his own mortality. It's a nice touch that adds a bit more depth to his character. However, his plans go awry when the King of Persia lets the prince keep the Dagger of Time, and decides to give the hourglass to a sultan that he is going to visit. He also rounds up several captured women, including the Princess Farah, and plans to also offer them as gifts to the sultan. When they arrive at the sultan's home, the vizier tricks the young prince into opening the hourglass with a dagger. As soon as the sands escape, they infect the whole area and transform everyone except for the prince, Farah, and the vizier into monsters. Now the prince must make his way through the abandoned palace in order to find the hourglass, stop the vizier, and hopefully undo what he unwittingly set in motion. The story is fairly simple and straightforward, but it does have more depth and nuance to it than most game stories. The prince and his companion Farah have unique and interesting personalities, and their banter is quite entertaining. Like the vizier, they both might seem like fairly straightforward characters, but there is more to them than meets the eye, and the relationship gets more fleshed out as the game progresses. When it comes to the gameplay, it does an excellent job of translating the running, jumping, climbing, and trap avoidance of the original into 3D spaces. It starts off nice and simple, and gradually makes the various challenges and puzzles more difficult as you get further into the game. The environments are also quite nice to look at, and there's something about the art style that really works. I'm not sure what it is, but the game still looks really nice even though it's quite old. One problem with the original game was that every time you died, you would have to start the section all over again, which could get increasingly annoying during the trickier parts of the game. Sands of Time addresses this issue by giving you the power to rewind time. The Dagger of Time you obtain near the beginning can collect the missing Sands of Time that have been scattered throughout the palace, and this can be used to undo mistakes. Accidentally misjudge a jump and end up falling 4 stories to your death? No worries, just rewind time back to the point before you made the mistake. It helps keep the flow of the game going, and gives the player more breathing room without punishing them too harshly for mistakes. But you can only rewind time a limited number of times, at least until you collect more sand, so you still have to be careful and not rely on it more than you have to. The puzzles and platforming are brilliantly put together, and require a lot more skill and thought to solve than most 3D platformers. Between the excellent gameplay, the well-written story and characters, and the gorgeous environments, Sands of Time is an extremely fun, well-put-together adventure that I could easily see myself giving a 9 or even 10 to, if it weren't for one major issue that drags the whole thing down, and that's the combat. In between the puzzles and platforming, you also have to fight sand zombies, people who have been infected with the Sands of Time, and who now cannot die unless they are stabbed with the Dagger of Time. The combat mechanics themselves aren't too bad. The prince's fighting style works well with the rest of the gameplay, and skillfully avoiding and defeating several enemies can be quite satisfying. The problem is that the combat takes up way too much of the game. For every encounter, the game keeps spawning wave after wave of enemies, to the point where it just ends up being tedious and boring. But more importantly, it also ends up being incredibly frustrating, as it's during these sections that you'll die a lot. And unlike the platforming challenges, where if you die it's because of a mistake you made that you can easily correct, here whether you live or die is largely down to trial and error. This is especially true when you're surrounded by entire hordes and you can't even see the prince. Also, there's this meter that drains whenever you rewind time, except it also drains for other stupid reasons. So if you get killed and you need to rewind time in order to undo it, if it was draining for some other stupid reason, too bad, back to the last checkpoint and you have to start the fight all over again. Farah can also be hurt by the enemies, and if she dies it's also game over, but protecting her is next to impossible. If you try to stay near her, then the enemies will just gather around you and her, and the sheer number of them makes it impossible to keep all of them away from her. So you're probably better off fighting away from her in order to draw enemies away from her, which usually works, except when there's enough enemies that 2 or more of them gang up on her. To summarize, the core combat is fine, but between all of the annoyances and the sheer number of enemies the game throws at you over and over again, the combat ends up being a massive chore that really drags the game down. It's a shame because everything else about the game is so damn good, but this one aspect is irritating enough to spoil that. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time does enough right that I can still recommend it, but its more obnoxious qualities prevent me from liking it as much as I want to. My final score is an 8 out of 10. If it wasn't for the stupid combat, I probably would have given the game a 9, or maybe even a 10. As it is, the combat ended up being infuriating enough that I'm unwilling to go any higher than an 8. So what do you think? Have you played Prince of Persia: Sands of Time? Which Prince of Persia game is your favorite? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.